Ashley, welcome to the Content 10X podcast.
Hey, good to be here.
It's really good to have you on. So I know we've spoken on a podcast before because I had you on B2B Content Strategist podcast, which was a brilliant conversation. We had so much good feedback from that. And I remember in that conversation, we kind of skimmed the surface and spoke about maximizing and repurposing content. And I remember in that moment thinking, I really need to bring you onto the Content 10X podcast where we speak a lot more about that. So I'm really pleased to have you on. And this is part of a B2B marketing mini-series that we're doing on the Content 10X podcast, where I'm speaking to yourself and other leaders in the B2B marketing space about, repurposing and maximizing content. You were one of the first people that I thought of, so thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
I'm very excited about this, although I will say, you've asked me to choose like some favorites and some bests, and those are hard questions. So, this might be, we might get a little emotional on this call about all the things here. How do you pick your favorite child, right? Like that's not supposed to do that.
I know, exactly. Well, we'll take best and favorite with the high pressure and a pinch of salt, I guess.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And a very good segue into that. So the first question. So what would you say is your favorite type of content to repurpose? And, why does that work so well for you, that type of content?
True to form, I'm gonna immediately come out of the gate and say two things, and I think that they're different enough that I think it's actually worth kind of diving into them throughout the conversation. So one is a traditional answer that you'll probably get from a lot of marketers, which is presentation slides. And I'm not specifically saying presentations like the entire recording, the slides themselves. The way I build my slides, I intentionally try to build them in a modular way so that I can repurpose portions of those slides into articles or into other presentations or into like LinkedIn carousel posts. So that's one. And then the other, since I just mentioned LinkedIn, is LinkedIn comments. I've been on a whole kick about this because I get a lot of questions from people about this. And commenting is a great way to grow not only your own personal brand in terms of building relationships, having conversations, but engaging in that way also primes the algorithm to give more reach to your original posts. So that's helpful regardless of whether you repurpose the comments. If you leave meaty comments, that actually can then turn into original posts from your own profile. It gives you the opportunity to then tag the original person who started the conversation, so they'll come back and engage. It then gives you the ability to kind of come back into that previous conversation and say, hey, we're actually continuing this conversation on my post. So there's a lot of opportunity to continue those conversations if you're leaving meaty comments. So those are two things that I'll say. And the way I repurpose them is a little bit different than the way most folks repurpose both of those types of content. So that's part of why they're my favorites, is because I actually get to do it in a way that works for me in a couple of different formats, assets, channels, etc.
I absolutely love that. And I actually I would not have foreseen that they were going to be your answers as well. So that's just fantastic. Could you give an example? So let's say with the slides, I'd just love to hear an example of that because it's just really interesting.
Sure. So I'll take a slight step back and say that from a mindset standpoint, I go into my content creation, whether that's for my personal content or for folks I'm working with the idea of creating modular content. So frequently when we hear about this, we'll hear people talk about content repurposing, and it's a little bit of a misnomer because they basically mean, just publish the slides as they are as a PDF on the website. And you're like, okay, that's not repurposing. That's just posting the slides. Or you'll hear people talk about snackable content. This has come up, and I'm internally, I'm like, guys, you don't actually want snackable. Snackable implies that you just need a quippy click because your audience can't pay attention for too long. And instead, what you want is modular, right? You want this content that you can break apart, that you can build in different ways, that you can pull together into something that's longer form. So given that context, the example of the slides that I love to use for my own personal example, which I have a lot of depth on because I've done it a number of times, is this idea of content depths. So conceptual, strategic, and tactical depth. I talk about this in my content strategy framework, which is focused on, the quippy way I say this is, the funnel is dead, use a playground instead. And so as we think about building out an audience journey, how do we create a delightful, seamless, impactful journey, no matter which way our audience travels? And I frame that up as a playground, and I talk about using content depths instead of using funnel stages. So that's one way that that set of slides gets used. I also use that set of slides in my thought leadership framework. So the 4 pillars of thought leadership. One of those is talking about depth of ideas and then also being prolific. And so I talk about using content depths to inform the narratives for your depth of ideas to help you codify that and share and be prolific. And so as part of my narratives worksheet that fits in with my thought leadership framework, I talk about addressing things at the conceptual, strategic, and tactical depth and saying, do you have a narrative when you're choosing what you're going to talk about from a thought leadership standpoint? Do you actually have enough depth in that idea to address it at these content depths? So that's another place it gets used. And then in my social media strategy, I have the social media spectrum, and I talk about how you can use different depths of content in your social media, particularly in that broadcast or conversation phase. Obviously, I talk about this from a community perspective as well. So those slides get reused there. Then I break those slides apart and turn them into LinkedIn carousels. And I've talked about this. I have an example that I use pretty frequently around fitness. And this is like a nice blend of my personal and professional. I call myself a fitness fiend in my bio. And so that's my go-to example to explain content depth. And so I've taken those slides and broken them up in a variety of different ways. And then I can put slightly different copy on it. So one question of, how do you come up with so much content? And it's like, oh, well, I just talk about the same content, but at different depths. Not familiar with depths? Here's a set of slides that explain this. Or someone will say, we're not going to use funnel stages. How are we going to map content? And I say, oh, content depths. It's the exact same set of slides with just slight reframing. If somebody says, Ashley, can you give a real world example of content depths? Yep. As a reminder, here's what content depths are. Here's the fitness slides, right? So I've reused that same set of like 5 slides over and over and over and over again. And then other times I've taken the speaker notes out of those slides and turned them into basically a narrative for a worksheet, for an article, for another talk track for a presentation. So that's the slides piece, and you can break it up. And again, you can see that it's not just posting the slides online. It's putting them into different talk tracks. It's taking a slightly different angle. It's taking a different depth on the content depth. Like it's a whole meta thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, gets quite meta, doesn't it? You're showing all the different depths of talking about what depth is and how you work with it. It's really, it's quite meta, and I absolutely love that concept of just taking things to a different depth. And like you said, obviously looking at completely different angles and ways to use the content and explaining things from the different depths that you can. How do you typically then go on to measure whether this is working? So I know there's loads of different ways that we can measure the effectiveness of content anyway. So it's a layered question on top, isn't it, in terms of the time and effort that you put into the repurposing. Is there certain ways that you're measuring if this approach works?
So in addition to all the ways that you would measure content, where, if you're starting to look from a overall standpoint at things like impressions, engagement, comments, conversion to an owned property, et cetera, the other big thing that I'm starting to look at is what I would call content velocity. So this is a different metric than more content, because you can create a lot of crap, especially with AI now. Like you can get 100 clips. Whether those clips are effective is a separate question. You can get 100 blog posts with AI. Just plop it into ChatGPT, get a transcript, slice and dice it, right? Whether those are effective is a separate question. So what I try to think of is content velocity. If I were to ask a human to generate 10 LinkedIn posts, generate 3 long form blogs, and generate, let's call it 3 presentations, how long does that take? How many hours of time does that take? How many different assets can you actually create? And how long does it take to do that? Versus if you repurpose it and you say, here's a piece of pillar content, make stuff with it? How fast can I turn that same set of assets? So it's not really about more or an output metric. It's more about how can I accelerate that time to value? And again, for me, because of the way that I create my own content and now the way that I'm working with other folks internally to shape that content, the time to value is much faster because we're not having to create from scratch. And we can say, oh, you can drop the entire intro and now you've effectively got 3 or 4 different angles on that same intro, but you don't have to create the slides from scratch. I'm actually working on an internal presentation right now about this concept. And I'm like, guys, I already have slides for this. Like, let me just drop this right in. And so I've saved a ton of time because I already have all of these slides. I'm going to tweak the talk track because the audience is different, but the slides themselves and the concept of it, I don't have to create all of that. And so I look at it as more of a velocity metric versus an output metric because there's some quality issues. And then also more is not necessarily better, right? Like you can only promote more so much. So that content velocity is a big thing that I'm starting to look at.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? And it's, if you have the same amount of time and you just keep putting that same amount of time to always starting with original thought and all of the brainstorming and idea searching and research and things like that, if it's always in that allocation of time, there's only so far you'll get. But if that allocation of time starts with something already and then you can get that velocity from quality content, then you're going to get more from the same allocation of time, basically, aren't you? Because you're removing all that original thought process and things like that of the actual concept of what you're trying to share, or the findings, the research, the insights, etc. What would you say is an example of maybe a project you've worked on or a specific piece of content where you saw just fantastic results and what they were? So something specific, and then what happened with that and how that connected with your audience.
I'll choose a super recent example from the LinkedIn comments, actually. So because I get this question a lot, people say, how do you leave good comments, or how do you come up with so much content? And then I say, well, actually, I repurpose a lot of my comments. So I actually went through and pulled examples of repurposing comments. And so this is something, again, this is a tactic that I've used a lot. And then I kept getting questions about it. So I was like, okay, we're going to go very meta and do a post showcasing the comments, right?
Again, yeah, I love this meta approach that you have.
yeah. It's just like comments all the way down, repurposing all the way down. So I pulled together basically a post highlighting a bunch of places where I had shared a meaty comment. And so I put in a link to the original post, both from me and from wherever I commented on it. And I did some screenshots of those comments. That post about comments actually generated, I would have to go look, but it was one of my top performing posts over the last quarter. It generated tens of thousands of views. But then off of that, I got invited to do a podcast about comments. And so that has now been repurposed. The advice about how to do comments has been repurposed. I ended up having several people share and say, here's how you do good commenting. Go look at Ashley's post and also share your content, right? So that was another thing where just the amount of tags that I got of people referencing that content and sharing it back with me. And then I actually ended up having somebody internally ping me, and they actually sit on the sales side of the house. And they're like, I came across your post talking about this. Like, how do I get you to help me create sales content? How do I get you on my sales calls? How do we bring this to our sellers in order for, how do we get this mindset into our sellers? And so I'm starting to have that conversation, starting to have the conversation about with our internal sales folks, how did they go do this on LinkedIn? And so that one post obviously generated a bunch of buzz, comments, engagement, etc. But the internal conversation with that and how that has actually now sparked some internal conversations about how do we get other people to do this, and how do our evangelists use this same tactic? That's been an additional ongoing thing. So aside from the standard, yay, the post did really well with a lot of impressions, seeing how many other conversations it sparked and the movement that has sparked internally and externally, that has been kind of a surprising and also very effective thing to see, where it was literally me just pulling screenshots of stuff that I've done over the last 2 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, you say literally you doing that, but it's because the stuff that you did was so good, excellent work and methods and what you've been doing and pulling together really, really good content and good examples, and people love it, obviously. The next question that I have, I feel like you might have almost just answered it, but maybe you've got something more up your sleeve, because I was going to ask about the most unexpected result that you've seen from repurposing. What you just said then sounded quite unexpected in terms of where that went. But do you have any other examples of just, wow, I kind of never saw that when I repurposed that content to that would be the result?
I think for me, I, in some cases early in my journey, stumbled on reusing things and being like, I'm pretty sure I think this just goes together. Like, oh, maybe I should figure out a new way to say it or something. And then just being like, no, I should just use this exact same thing. And I think for me, the longevity and the realization that you get tired of your own stuff much sooner than other people do. And just the number of different conversations that I've had about the same core concept, I think has been very unexpected to me, that I come up with a slightly new angle on it. But to me, I'm because, it's my content, or if I'm working very closely with a subject matter expert, we're so close to the content that to us, we think it's the same. And then we put it out there and it sparks this completely different conversation. And we're like, oh, we thought we were repurposing, but actually the market perceives it as net new. And I think that's overall has been a very unexpected result, that we can take these conversations much further than we originally thought, because we're so close to the content that we almost didn't realize that we were saying effectively something that would be perceived as new to the market.
Yeah. And I think coming back to when you were talking about the depth as well, because you are explaining things, constantly at a different depth as well. It's that adds that extra layer as well. If it's new, isn't it? Every time you're approaching it, you're taking it from a different angle, different depth, things like that. So that there's just not seen as being repetitive, because not everybody is paying attention to every single thing you say all the time, and new audiences are reached all the time as well. So no, I really love that. What about in terms of an unexpected repurposing opportunity? So I wanted to just share an example of what I mean by that. So as we're recording this episode today, episode 299 of the podcast is going live, and I talked with Liz Elfman from Data World about a really interesting story where she repurposed 1 year's worth of LinkedIn posts by one of their lead data scientists at the company she works at into an ebook. So they took a year's worth of LinkedIn posts, turned them into an ebook. And I just thought, wow, sometimes you plan all the repurposing and you have all these methods and you know exactly what you're creating and what you're repurposing into and things like that. And then sometimes opportunity strikes and you think that is an unexpected opportunity to repurpose, but I'm going to go for it. Do you have an example of that kind of thing, like a very unexpected opportunity that presented itself?
I'll go super specific and super tactical, taking the opposite of whatever you just said. So, for example, one of my colleagues was talking about, I work with a lot of Agile and DevOps folks, and so we talk to a lot of technical audiences. And so he had a slide where he was basically showing all of these metrics going up as a sign that everything was healthy, right? And from a repurposing standpoint, it's like, you could just take the opposite of that, and everything going down means that things are unhealthy. And now you get two posts out of the same graphic. Just turn the arrows red and slightly reframe it. So that's been, yeah. And then seeing how you can basically turn that into like 5 different posts, where you have the first post is, here's 5 signs that, things are going well. Here's 5 signs that things are going poorly. Here's how you can improve things. Here's how to prevent things from going poorly. And then you can turn that into a whole article that's got a slightly different flavor of all of that, off of basically just one original set. Literally in this case, it was just a single image and some speaker notes. And so that's been something where we've been able to kind of like play with it, to take the opposite and just slightly tweak it a little bit. The other thing that's been interesting in kind of that same vein is, for example, at Atlassian, we talk a lot about our values. We have 5 core values. Those are really central to how we get work done. And so we've worked with a couple of different leaders to like write how those values impact different types of work. And it's this long form article. And it's like, you can actually do a whole series of posts about each value, how it shows up, other companies that have that value. And so that's something that we've been able to kind of take that in from a talk track standpoint and say, here's some ways we can weave in customer stories. So for example, one of our values is open company, no BS. The way that manifests from a product standpoint and a culture standpoint is that all of our Confluence pages are open by default. So as a marketer, I can go in and read what all these other teams are working on. We also have a very strong internal blogging culture. And so I see content from our subject matter experts. That's an opportunity for me to connect this open company, no BS value to the way that we set up and operate our products, to external thought leadership and sharing that I found because our products are open. There's a couple of our customers. HubSpot also has a very similar mindset and use case. And so we actually partnered with HubSpot a couple of years ago to bring them to our conference to talk about this. And so that's an area where kind of unexpectedly, we were able to say like, wait, we can connect the values to the product, to a use case, and there's a customer story. Like we can put all of that together. So those are 2 examples that I would say were kind of unexpected.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. You kind of answered this next question a little bit as well through what you've been talking about, because I wanted to ask you how you decide which content is worth the effort of repurposing. So, if there's certain boxes that you look to be ticked to think, right, let's put the effort into this. You've talked quite a lot already about the things that you look for, like everything you just said, basically, of all those things that you've spotted that made you think we've got something here. But it's a question I often get asked of like, but how do we decide what to repurpose? And is there just like a certain set of boxes that we should tick that say plow lots of time into repurposing that and then just don't repurpose that? It's not going to be worth it. And I know there's never really a complete black and white answer, but you stand on that.
Again, I'll zoom out and say that where possible, I actually think that this, like thinking about that distribution piece up front so that you can shape the content. So this comes up a lot. I've given some super tactical examples of, don't say, in this series, we'll say, we'll talk about X, Y, and Z. Or in part 1, we'll talk about X, Y, and Z. Okay, that makes it a lot harder for us to be able to repurpose, to slice and dice it, or to put it into other things, because now you're missing that context, or you're stuck doing an entire series and it turns out the first video flopped, right? Or slight rephrasing, instead of saying, as I mentioned earlier, or if you remember a few slides ago, don't frame it that way because now I can't parse it out or I can't put it together. Just say, if we agree that this concept is true, and it's the same concept you just mentioned. Another example, you like name your nouns. So people frequently will just say, at Atlassian, we believe X. And then throughout the presentation, they'll just say, we. Well, now it's really hard for me to repurpose that because I don't know who we is. Do you mean Atlassian? Do you mean Jira? Right? So at the outset, if you can look at that content and say, we know we want this to be repurposed, shaping that content from the beginning. Like if you have control over that, that's great. The second thing I'll say is, and this is coming from like a SaaS context, in general, I struggle to repurpose demos and tutorials because we ship so frequently that the product screenshots get out of date, the talk track gets out of date. We have a bunch of net new stuff. And so frequently it's hard, right? Because getting demos can be very difficult by the time you set up the environment, by the time you get the script, by the time you get it all recorded, right? And so there's this sense that like, man, we should turn this demo into a tutorial, or we should turn this tutorial into a demo. But that content tends to be not very evergreen. And so I would say picking content that is more evergreen as a repurposing tool, and then saying, okay, we're going to put the time in to plan that ahead, versus we know that we have a release, we've got a monthly demo series, like it's going to be better for us to just create this net new. That also then helps you understand the investment that you should put in on that monthly demo series, that maybe you probably shouldn't spend $5, $10, $20,000 on a single video if you're just going to redo it every month, right? So that's another thing. And then I think anything where you're doing original research, so surveys, reports, guides, economic impact reports, where that content is original, it's got net new insights, and it tends to be something that you invest a lot of upfront time and money into in the original pillar asset. That would be something that we would mark to be like, all right, if we're going to pay 50 grand for this report, by the time we, get a survey done with actually statistically significant data and get the design and get a web page, obviously making sure that you can start to pull stuff out of that report and having a plan for that would be another very obvious one to be like, yep, 100% we're going to repurpose that. So that's some thinking on how to shape it if you have input into that in the beginning. Types of content that are probably not great for repurposing, and therefore you need to balance the investment in each of those original assets. And then the stuff where all right, this is probably excellent for repurposing. It's got a big investment. It's got evergreen. It's got net new information. Let's put the time into that.
I completely agree with you. And I think with as you said, the original research, say you've invested $50,000 or something like that into some fantastic survey, research report, these great insights, things like that. It's going to be perfect for repurposing into lots of different content. But, you are going to add that extra budget then on top, aren't you? So, the 50, you might add another 15, that might go to then 65 because we'll invest another 15 into the repurposing of this. But what you will get, it's like, there's so much more than if that 15 budget just went on another cornerstone piece over there and a new piece of research or something like that, whatever that may be, because you'll get so much more if you just tag that extra repurposing budget onto the big piece, won't you? So I really love that answer. And like you said as well, just sometimes it comes down to the longevity of the content and the time, whether it's evergreen or time bound. And if you're going to repurpose it, then watching your language to make sure that you don't date things and things like that. So I really love that. So many great tips in there, especially love what you said about like the nouns and the number of times that we're repurposing content, and it can be quite hard to pick standalone clips out because of exactly what you said. It's like, but it doesn't stand alone because they just said we, like you said, but the definition of we was in the minute before, and searching for standalone value can be quite hard if it's not presented with that in mind, and there's too many cross references constantly to things that were said before and after and things like that. So I really love that. What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions that fellow B2B marketers may have about repurposed content? So sometimes if you hear people saying yeah but towards repurposing, kind of misconceptions, or what's the biggest misconception you tend to hear?
I'll give two answers. The first is that repurposing means breaking content apart, that it's only taking long form content and making it short. That is not correct. Repurposing can be taking a bunch of short form content and making it long, or putting some short form content into some long form content, or changing one long form asset type like video into another long form asset type like a downloadable PDF or a long form blog. So that's the first thing. Repurposing does not mean make it shorter in every case. The second thing is that repurposed content gets stale. Usually that's because people aren't actually doing repurposing, repackaging, recycling. There's a lot of re's. They think that repurposing just means reposting the exact same thing everywhere. And so therefore it gets stale. Well, I've I've promoted this PDF 10 times on Twitter, so now it's stale. Well, no, the content itself is not stale. It's that you just published the same, you didn't actually repurpose it. You just published the same thing 10 times. That's why it's not getting engagement, because you didn't actually repurpose it, right? And again, the number of times where if you actually repurpose it, you pull out a set of slides and you come up with 10 different pieces of copy and you post that once a month for 10 months. I guarantee you, nobody in month 10 remembers what the heck you said in month 1, even if it's the same set of slides. If you take blog posts and you take the opposite, 5 signs of a healthy team, and then 3 months later, 5 signs of a dysfunctional team, and then 3 months later, signs like 3 signs of a healthy team, 3 signs of a dysfunctional team, and 5 ways to improve your team health. Nobody remembers that the 5 things and the 3 things are that it's the exact same content, right? Nobody remembers that. So those are the 2 big misconceptions I see, is the make it shorter and then it gets stale. Usually the reason it gets stale is because you have not actually repurposed it. You've just spammed it and spammed the same thing in a bunch of different channels.
And I love what you said in terms of, nobody will notice if you were doing the slightly different spin on things and sharing over time. And I always think to myself, if you are getting people saying, isn't this similar to what you posted a few months ago or whatever, I mean, well done, because you've got such a completely engaged audience. They follow every word that you say and remember everything. Like, actually, like, that's not a bad thing, is it? That means that you are, you've got some avid followers there, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I've been talking about, for example, like the content playground and my thought leadership framework at this point for several years. And I do have some very loyal and engaged followers. We've had Zoom calls, we DM, they're in my comments all the time. And even when they say, oh, a few months ago, you actually posted this other thing about this same topic, and I really loved how you said it then, they're not calling me out for talking about the same topic or for reusing the same slides. They're making a connection, and they're actually quite pleased with themselves that they made this connection. And they're like excited to remember that I already said this, right? So unless, again, anybody that's saying like, you just talk about the same thing all the time, okay, well, if they're calling you out angrily about that, it's probably not because of repurposed content. It's probably because you're just reposting the same thing over and over, and they're like, this is not new, you've already said this, right? But for the most part, if you're doing actual repurposing, repackaging, resharing, recycling, reswizzling, however you want to call it, most of the time, if your followers notice, they're like thrilled that they made the connection.
Yeah. People like seeing reminders of good content again. And, I'm the same. People will more just say, oh, thanks for the reminder on this. Like, I remember you mentioning this and thank you for the reminder. And people like seeing good content again. You do a good job of repackaging and sharing in different ways, but let's face it, Netflix paid hundreds of millions to show reruns of Friends because people like to watch good things again. People do like to see good things again. So as long as you've got confidence that it's valuable and you're saying something that's going to help people, then, like you said, if you do feel like you're just banging the same drum and people are getting bored, you're probably not doing it right. Is there an example of any kind of big repurposing mistake or fail that you've ever seen? You don't have to name anyone. I'm not saying to like throw anyone under the bus or anything, but where you've just gone, man, I'm just looking at this and this is a really bad example of repurposing.
The whole take a screenshot of your tweet and post it on LinkedIn, or take a screenshot of your LinkedIn post and post it on Twitter. And again, I know we're supposed to call it X. No one knows what X is. We're going to call it Twitter so we have clarity. Let's be clear here. But that, no, like, I just struggle. And again, it's working fine for some people, actually. There's a few creators who it actually is working for, but I just roll my eyes at that. And again, if you know what you're doing, fine. Like, we all know that content is a screenshot of a tweet. But that's the biggest one that I see that I'm just like, y'all, that's not repurposing, that's resharing. And I guess if it's working for you, carry on. But like, let's be clear. This is not some super secret strategy that you've unlocked the Holy Grail. Like, you're just taking screenshots of stuff you posted elsewhere. Like, that's what's happening.
I think I did an entire podcast episode on that once, like quite a while ago, because it's been like you said, it's been around for a while. I think I did a whole episode on lazy repurposing in a way, in terms of just taking a screenshot from Twitter and putting it elsewhere. But it is funny, like you said, in terms of even these things for certain people, certain audience and stuff, it works, doesn't it? We did have a client and who that like part of their Instagram approach was Twitter screenshots. But it was funny doing a content review. It was quite surprising. We were looking at every type of content, like meme, GIF, tweet, image, photograph, and then like over a period of time, how did the different types perform? And we were really surprised at how the tweet images were performing so better than the memes and GIFs and like things that you think would do better on Instagram. But it's all down to audience, isn't it? And what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other. But I love that. It's a good example.
It's funny because on one hand, I want it to not be true, but I know there's a couple folks who come to mind where I'm like, it works for them. It's so annoying. But also, if it's working and it's easy, you already came up with the content, all you got to do is grab a screenshot. Like, dude, that is so much time saving. So it's funny where I guess I shouldn't call it a mistake. I should call it an eye-rolly thing that it's annoying that it works. Like it should be a mistake, but somehow for some people and some platforms and audiences, it's not a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, and in that case, if you're doing something super easy and seeing it work really well, then you cannot blame someone for keeping doing it, can you? But yeah, no. Well, I should change that to what's your eye roll moment for repurposing. I think that'd be a good question. So this has been such a really good conversation. You've talked about things that I wasn't expecting to be talking about, the comments and the slides and things like that. And that's exactly why I wanted to have these conversations, to talk about some really different angles in repurposing. The final question, so if you could give one piece of advice to a B2B marketing manager with a very small team, but they have a desire to start really making the most out of the content and they're not really embracing repurposing at the moment, what would that one piece of advice be to this B2B marketing manager with a small team?
Lean into AI. And I know that sounds funny, but I've been experimenting with a lot of different tools and workflows and that kind of thing over the last quarter or so. And you're not going to replace the humans, but you can get machine-generated transcripts. You can get machine-generated blog drafts to start with. You can get machine-generated clips where you can start to adapt those things. Like, lean into those tools and then use the humans to refine things instead of forcing the humans to have to go through and manually do all of that. That would be what I would say is like, keep an open mind about AI. You're still going to have humans pairing. Like, you can't just start sharing whatever AI puts out, but keep an open mind, look at those tools, because there's a lot of really awesome stuff that's coming out now where you can save a lot of that upfront sifting time and get a starting point faster so that you can accelerate that content velocity.
And do you have any specific standout tools that you really like or that you see getting better and would recommend?
I am early enough in the journey right now that we're still vetting all the tools. So I'm hesitant to give a current recommendation just because we have not settled on a stack yet, and I'm still vetting tools. So I'll withhold my tool thing. I'm happy to share. If people want to DM me, I'm happy to share the journey, but I feel a little twitchy about being like, here's exactly what you need at this point, because we're definitely still in the exploratory phase of that journey.
Yeah, no, we are as well, actually. We've even got a couple of demo calls booked in next week with a couple of different tools that we're interested in, because we're the same as you. Like, I wouldn't stand up and say, these are the tools to use or the best ones, because I hate recommending things if I can't wholeheartedly say that I truly use it and think it's great. And we aren't there yet either. But I love that answer. Of course, it's such a good 2024 answer, small team, embrace repurposing, look to see what AI can do. So that's fantastic. Love it. Well, Ashley, thank you. It's been a fantastic conversation. I knew it was going to be good to begin with, and it surpassed all expectations as well. So thank you. Where would you like people to go to connect with you and let you know that they listened to this episode and really enjoyed it?
You'll be shocked. LinkedIn.
Real shock, yeah.
I'm a LinkedIn fangirl and a LinkedIn nerd. So you can find me on Twitter, but the best place is LinkedIn.
Oh yeah, go follow, go connect with Ashley, go follow Ashley on LinkedIn. Amazing content on LinkedIn. I think when I first invited you on to B2B Content Strategist and we first met, it was through, just seeing all the great LinkedIn content that you're putting out. So go follow Ashley, go and see all the great content all the time, connect, say hi. That'd be great. Yeah, so thanks, Ashley. Well, it's been brilliant. Thank you for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope to have you back on again another time soon as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me.